Welcome to this afternoon's webinar with DFI. The topic for today is around managing cyber risk for financial inclusion of the last mile. I'm really pleased that we're running today's webinar with a number of amazing organizations, and we're really pleased to have Institute of Risk Management, Digital Frontiers Association Uganda, and the Mozambique FinTech Association supporting today's session. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Corley. I'm Deputy Director of DFI, and I run DFI's webinar and podcast series. So I'm really pleased to be with you today. And thank you for taking time out to join us. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we begin. So today's session is being recorded, which means that we will be sending you a summary and a recording either tomorrow or early next week. That is just in case you get disconnected from today's session, but also more importantly, if you really love today's session, we would absolutely love it if you then shared that recording within your network as well, so more people can hear our discussions for today. We also are going to have your Q&As, your questions. Please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen with Zoom. And try not to put your questions in the chat. It's much easier for us to see and get round to answering all your questions if they're in the Q&A function. So as I said, today's webinar, we're going to look at cyber risks, what challenges organizations are facing. And when you sort of think about what's happened in the world over the last year and a half, we know that things such as the COVID-19 pandemic have really escalated the digital transformation. And so managing those risks, those new risks, and also existing risks that have always been there is really key for success to help with your reputation and stability of what's going on in the financial world. So this webinar is going to cover some tips and some practical exercises and examples to help you identify and manage your risk. But also I can promise you, risk can be maybe a little bit of a dry topic sometimes. And sometimes we have those risk managers who to them doing anything is a risk. However, we're trying to give you a new perspective today on, actually, if we don't have some risk, we can't do anything. So today's webinar really is going to try and cover how to manage risks well and what risks that you actually need to take in order to do something. I'm delighted that today I have a co-moderator with me. Usually I do this job on my own, but I'm absolutely delighted today to introduce you to Ian Mugisha, who is going to help with the moderation. Why have I picked Ian? Well, Ian is chair of the Uganda chapter of the Institute of Risk Management. He's also director of Digital Frontiers Association Uganda. He's one of the DFI alumni and also our brand ambassador in Uganda, and is the author of a book called Uncertain, which is all about risk management. So when I was thinking of a co-moderator, who better than Ian? So I'm absolutely delighted that he's here, and I'm going to hand over to Ian, who is going to introduce our panelists and get today's webinar going. So over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Sarah. Wonderful introduction of the event and your key panelists, myself. Well, let me take it on from here. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm hoping all of you are within the same time range, about 2 to 3 hours. Thank you for joining in. Paul Kelly, one of our key panelists today, has experience in aviation, experience in financial services, and various other aspects. Most interesting thing about Kelly's perspective to risk management is how he sees risk as an enabler for business and an enabler for having things done. And that's what brings the balance to the team today. We shall also be listening from João Gaspar, a member of a certified member of CDFP, alumni of BFI, and also the chairperson of the association in Mozambique, and with a wealth of experience in various sectors, and most importantly, supporting NGOs, governments, and the private sector in developing solutions for financial inclusion. Allan, a tech guru with experience in telecom and practically developing tools and providing services for the last mile. So with us, we have a very well-balanced team, and I would like to give a chance to Paul to probably make some remarks as we kick off the discussion for tonight. Thank you very much. Paul, please, you're up.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Sarah. Hi, I'm Paul. I'm Paul Kelly, and I'm a bit of a sort of risk management heretic, if you like. So for me, risk management is all about taking risk, and it's about understanding the risks that we're taking and why we're taking them. It's not just about managing risk to zero, which is what a lot of people think. So for me, I'm going to start with risk management, and I'll come on to cybersecurity because the two are linked. But fundamentally, for me, risk management is 3 simple questions. And what I find is more often than not, people get question 1 wrong. And those 3 simple questions start with question 1, which is, what are we trying to achieve? Question 2 is, what's the stuff that's going to trip us up along the way and prevent us achieving question 1, the answer to question 1. And then question 3 is, what are we doing about it? And what do I mean then around how people get question 1 wrong? So I've seen large organizations, small organizations, but if you, what I often find is that people will answer question 1 associated with what their function is trying to achieve, as opposed to what their organization is trying to achieve. So for example, I used to work for a bank, and they wanted to help their customers achieve their hopes, dreams, and ambitions. Right. So in reality, everybody in the bank should answer question 1 with help our customers achieve their hopes, dreams, and ambitions. But what you find, of course, is for example, the fraud team will turn around and say they would answer question 1, well, reduce fraud to a minimum. And then you've got to say at what cost. So you see people spending £1.5 million on controls for a fraud that's only costing us £100,000. Then you might have an argument with them and say, well, why are we doing that? Why don't we just stop spending the £1.5 million? And the answer that comes back is, but risk will go up. But it's £1.5 million that could be going to help somebody grow their business or buy their house and all the rest of it. And if your fraud level is only £100,000, the fraud has got to go up a really long way till it's anywhere near the rentable value of that 1.5 million. So identifying what are you trying to achieve is probably the most important thing, because then you can decide whether you actually have a risk, because a risk is only relevant to what you're trying to achieve. And another example that I would use from my previous past, and I always like to do this just to see, and unfortunately I can't ask you all to raise your hands and show me, but we'll run it as if I could, and you can answer silently to yourselves. So my background, I used to be an aircraft engineer, officer in the military, used to worry about putting airplanes in the sky. So imagine that I have a fighter jet sat on the line and the oxygen system doesn't work. Do I let the airplane go flying? So I'm going to imagine that some of you have probably said no. Some of you might have said yes. And I wonder how many of you have said, well, I don't know, what's the task? You've jumped into, there's a risk because the oxygen system doesn't work. But if the task is to just fly low level, below 10,000 feet, you can do it all day, every day, with the airplane with no oxygen system. All you have to do is tell the pilot, don't fly above 10,000 feet. You've got no oxygen system. And actually, to fix the oxygen system is a waste. Yeah, because you don't need it for that task. But if on the alternative is to go and fly at 20,000, 30,000 feet where you do need an oxygen system, then clearly you need to fix it. It becomes a real risk, and it's a risk to life, and it needs to be fixed. But the key thing here is it's back to answering question 1. And often people identify things as risks. They say, oh, it's a risk. But a risk to what? And is it really aligned to what we're trying to achieve? If you don't have a web presence, for example, is DDoS on a website something that you need to worry about for cybersecurity? Probably not. But you need to think about things relative to what they're trying to say. So that's the first thing, is your risk management should really be about focusing on what am I trying to achieve, and what is the stuff that's going to trip me up along the way, and what am I doing about it? And so that I know the risks that I am taking in order to achieve something. The key thing here is it's when you open your doors to business, you are always going to take risk. What you need to be able to do is to understand the risks that you're taking and make sure that they're an acceptable level for you to achieve that. Is it worth taking the potential for this loss for this gain? It's a balance. Now, a lot of people talk about risk appetite, and I like to talk about risk appetite because I like to have a risk appetite of as low as reasonably practicable. It's possibly not seen, but it's the appetite that we use in risk to life industries. And what it means is, if you imagine there's a curve and it's a exponential curve, there is an amount of effort that you can put into putting controls in place or putting mitigation in place to reduce your risk. And it probably won't cost very much and it might reduce your risk a lot. But over time, you're going to find that that return becomes a lot less, and eventually you could end up spending lots and lots of money for very little gain. And you don't really want to be in that space because it's not as low as reasonably practicable. And in the end, you're diverting money away from your core activity of what you're trying to achieve. And my favorite way to talk about it or to demonstrate it is back to aviation, because it's pretty straightforward and everybody can see that. So as low as reasonably practical, I can tell you that it's well documented, well known, well tried and tested, that if you turn all the seats round on an airliner so that everybody faces backwards, more people survive crashes. So the question is, why don't airlines do it? Well, the answer is because it's not as low as reasonably practical. It's actually a very straightforward thing. It's not going to cost you very much money to do that, but it will cost you in terms of your customers. I would argue over 50% of people do not like traveling backwards. You know, if you get on a train, people will choose to face the direction of travel rather than travel backwards. And so the airlines quite rightly say is, well, okay, yes, there is a minor gain in more people survive crashes, but airplanes don't crash very often. So it's a really minor gain in safety. And that minor gain is not worth killing my business by losing 50% of my customers. And so you need to think about that balance when you're managing risk, because it is about taking risk. So they take the risk, and it's like, fair enough, that makes sense, because they've got it to a point as low as reasonably practical. And I would go, that extra step is probably unreasonable because you put yourself out of business. So I'd like to turn the conversation a little bit now onto cybersecurity. So everything I've said about risk management applies to cybersecurity. You've got to work out what it is you're trying to achieve. And there are lots of different cyber threats out there. We could spend the whole session talking about those different cyber threats. But for me, the key element is about doing that thought process up front around what are the things that are going to trip you up, prevent you achieving your goals, and what are you doing about them. But also what you want to do is to make sure that whatever you do about them doesn't impede your ability to continue to achieve those goals. So, for example, if you put in security systems that made the customer experience so awful that nobody would buy your product, which we're back to the same deal as the airline, then you're not actually achieving those goals. Now, the key for me is thinking about those things all the way up front and incorporating your security needs into your design requirements, because it's so much easier to do it at the design level and try to make your cybersecurity mitigation seamless rather than bolt it on afterwards. It's the same with any design principle or anything that you build. It's easier to change things when it's at a design stage than when it's been built and then you try to retrofit it. You know, if you try to take modern safety systems from a car and try to bolt them into a car from 50 years ago, it's going to be a bit more difficult, whereas you can design them in straight away. I mean, my other sort of chat around that is it's always cheaper and easier to change the design before you've built it. After you've built it, it's really difficult. So you need to think about that, but you need to be trying to do it so that it's protecting your business, protecting your customers, but it's not necessarily impeding your customer experience. And it's not an impossible task, it's just about creating that right balance. What else have I talked about? So regulations was another piece that I was asked to talk about, and regulatory risk. I think you can end up in, it sort of depends on what you want a risk management function to do for you, or a regulatory compliance to do for you. Often we end up with a knee-jerk reaction that says there's a regulation and off we need to go and try and build something to fit that regulation. So we retrofit problems into our design, and we start to build our design and make it more complicated because we're trying to meet a regulatory objective. But I think if you go back to the start and say, well, certainly within financial services, what is the point of the regulator? What is it that regulators are there for? Well, they're there to protect the financial system and protect customers. And the reason that they've become regulators is because in the past, people have done things that don't protect customers, or they don't protect the financial system. So if you start with an approach that says, I'm going to protect customers, I'm going to protect the financial system, I'm going to do my best in all of these different things, and then you create your own processes to achieve all those things and keep them nice and slick and simple, what you will probably find is that you've met the regulations. And so it's starting with, what is the purpose? Is your business purpose, trying to achieve those things? And then you can go back and do a sort of audit against the regulations and say, well, okay, I have achieved this or I haven't achieved this. But for the most part, you will have your solution. And if you put at the heart, the same as a sort of building in your cybersecurity, building in your regulatory compliance, is to understand what is the purpose that they're seeking and to build that in to your purpose. And then you can build great products. I think there's a few more things I agreed to talk about, and I'm much better at a conversation, so I'm just going to run around a little bit. And if I go back to this about design, and it's about design thinking, it's about keeping things simple, really. I'm a great believer in keeping things simple. Keep your processes simple, keep your designs simple, be it cybersecurity, be it your approach to life. Customers like things to be simple. How many times have you sort of personally gone, do you know what, this is way too difficult to go through all these different things, I don't want this enough, and then walked away? And why do I say that? I mean, even with cybersecurity, so I've heard people say, actually, the fact that our network is really complex is a real benefit, because it's quite difficult to navigate, and if somebody got in, a hacker got in, they'd find it difficult to navigate, etc., etc. Well, if you think back to what we're trying to achieve, which is we're trying to identify the bad guys, my answer to that is, how much easier is it to hide in a maze than it is to hide in a corridor? If you've got a straightforward corridor, you can identify things that are going wrong really quickly. And so if I bring it all the way back to risk management, again, what are we trying to achieve? What's the stuff that's going to trip us up along the way? And what are we doing about it? Now, some of the things we might not know what's going to trip us up along the way, but we want to be able to be alerted. We want to be detected so that we can see when things are starting to go wrong early enough. If we keep our processes simple and we measure them, we can see when things are starting to go wrong much earlier than there would be in a really complex process, because complex processes often become opaque, and it's really difficult to see when things are going wrong and then to take action quickly. So, my sort of pleas to all of you out there is, one is about, let's say, I'll just go back to the beginning, is risk management is about taking risk. It's about helping your business understand the risks that it's taking and making sure that they are acceptable risks to take. That's its purpose, because you do not get any commercial benefit without taking any risk. The easiest way to take no risk, obviously, is to shut your business and walk away. Is to not do anything. The safest airplane is the one that just sits on the ground and doesn't do anything. And aviation's a great way to learn about that, because when you go flying, you have to take risk. Gravity's unforgiving. It's one of those things. It's all about trying to achieve something. So we're going to take this risk in order to achieve getting somewhere quickly. So keep that in mind. Make sure that the risks that you are thinking about are relative to what you're trying to achieve, be they cybersecurity risks or any of those things. Think of them as threats, if you like. If you think of the things as threats to what are you trying to achieve, then you need to decide whether you're going to deal with that threat and do something, or avoid the threat by doing something that means the threat can't arise, or just accept it. If the threat arrives, we'll deal with it. And then decide exactly what are you doing about those things that are threats to what you're trying to achieve. But the key for me, though, is whatever you do, is try and incorporate it right at the beginning rather than add it in afterwards. It's far more difficult if you add it in afterwards. And also, keep your processes simple. They're easier to understand, they're easier to control, and actually they're much easier to cost as well. It's much easier to understand whether your business is making money or not, and where it's making money and where your costs are, et cetera, by keeping things simple. I'm hoping that that's a good enough runaround, and we can have lots and lots of time to chat in discussion, and I can answer your questions that way. But my one thought of leaving you is risk management is about understanding the risks that we take and making sure that they're appropriate for what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you so much, Paul. That's a very wonderful quotes there about risk management. And I couldn't help but notice the fact that when we talk about risk, one must be really aware of what they are trying to achieve, as you highlighted. And there's a famous quote I've always seen around of risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. So in the event that you do not know what you're doing, whether it's an institution, an individual, objective, whichever it is, if your objectives are not well set, if you don't really understand where you're going, you're probably not going anywhere then. So you don't know how early to wake up, what means of transport to use to get wherever you're going. So it's really important that we also go back to objective setting as we manage our risks, or as we come up with whatever risk that we are associated with. And that way you're able to understand how best to maneuver around it. And we give a very good example when you talk about regulation. Is it a responsibility of the institution to make sure that they have very good regulations and have a clean environment, compliant, but there's no profit? Or is it a balance of the two? So with that, I think the viewers will agree that first of all, you need to know which industry you're dealing in. How best can you utilize your resources to achieve your objectives? So along the way, of course, you're going to find some issues or some mishaps, and the best way to manage them is really by keeping focused with the objectives and seeing how best you maneuver around the different issues that you might find along the way. It's more like a journey. You find a pothole, or you find a diversion. How do you go around it? How do you make sure you get to your destination? So I like the points that you've thrown out there. So I would like to pass to Allan to bring on the understanding of fintechs. What are the challenges you're faced with? What are those hiccups? What are those risks that you're faced as you manage fintechs, as you develop the different technologies that are out there? What are you facing, and how best can we learn from you, either from a consumer perspective or from a developer's perspective, considering that you also directly interact with the consumers?
Yes, thank you, Ian, for the question. By definition, starting a company or starting a business or a startup company is risk. Actually, it is. It really is the craziest thing you can do with your life. It will affect your finances, your personal finances, put them at risk, your relationships, your marriage. So that is the true definition of risk. And when you decide to do that in Uganda, of all places, I think now you've reached levels of insane risk. Because and so the big challenge that really face as a startup, really by definition, is that you're resource constrained. And so because you're resource constrained, you really have to be making choices about where to spend your little money. And because you're trying to drive high growth and high value building, sometimes I'm not sure but you take, Paul Kelly was saying, reasonable risk. I think sometimes you take unreasonable risk. And so I would say that the biggest challenge is that because sometimes you are resource constrained, by definition, a startup, we're taking insane risks. Yeah. I don't know whether that answers the question. Yeah.
I mean, I'll just answer that. I think that's okay, so long as you know that they're insane risks when you take them,
Yeah.
and that you're comfortable taking them. You know, back to Ian's point earlier, it's the bit that where you're taking risk and you're not completely aware of the risk that you're taking. That's the danger.
Absolutely.
You know, it just means that you've got a high appetite for risk, but sometimes that's required to deliver that high growth. But it is just about, so long as you're comfortable and you know that that's what you're doing and you're prepared to take it, then that's fine. I don't see that as an issue, because it's about being aware, not trying to run away from it.
Absolutely. And just to follow up on what Paul has said, I think our job as entrepreneurs is to do something highly risky and reduce its risk over time. Yeah. And so once you reduce its risk, then you make it more valuable and you get higher returns. So that is really what my job is to do, to reduce risk every single day. Yeah. For something that is highly, highly risky.
Thank you very much, Alan. I would like to, Paul made it clearer. I want to bring in the appetite bit. We're trying to avoid academic risk management, particularly for education, because we want to break down risk as much as possible for every player in this industry to appreciate, but also for the last person or the last mile being the consumer, being the disadvantaged people that you're trying to reach out across the globe. Very good examples are refugees. Because of these risk matrices and all that, people are not able to get access to financial services as basic as having an account and being able to transact. So I'd like to leave a question for thought as I go to João. How is the change in the financial regulation right now in Uganda? We are aware that the regulator, Uganda Commercial Bank, that is the commercial banking regulator, has just recently taken on a decision or a position whereby they are going to regulate telcos. The telcos have been enjoying the mobile money banking financial services. And how does that play with the last mile, considering that people have for a long time run away from the banks due to the different charges and all that? I want to leave that thought to you and anyone else who can answer that. How is it going to play in the market? How is it going to improve or decrease the financial inclusion level that you're struggling with? But before you answer that, I think at some point you'll have to drop it in. João, you've had a very good experience. You've traveled across the world. You've helped different institutions develop services for financial services in particular. You run a fintech. I mean, the exposure is enormous. You lead the Association of Digital Frontiers back home. I'm just wondering, what cybersecurity threats could we be aware of, and how best can we manage them? I know we've been throwing around statements like having the objective and having the risk appetite in place, understanding what you're developing and doing, but do we have any particular ones that we think are affecting the way we approach.
Okay. Hello. Thank you, Ian, and hello, everybody. I didn't catch the last part of your question, but I think that I understood what you mean. But before talking about what are the cyber risks, let me also express my opinion about how can we at the fintechs manage the risks, and why don't we? Why do you need to manage the risks, and what risks can we take in order to put our services in front of the public? Because, as Paul said very well, if we don't have to take some risks, we don't have products and we don't have services, because all the services have implicit a certain dose of risk. Let me give you an example. Recently, one of the fintechs here in Mozambique launched a new payment service for the customers. It's a new startup and it's a new service based on a mobile application, and it's open for everybody to download the application from Google Play Store or from iOS. Apple Store. So how can we prevent that only a certain amount of people can have access to that application and the others cannot access, because the application is only targeted for a certain audience or a certain geographic area. But since it is on the Play Store, everybody can download the application. So how can we mitigate the risk for anybody to open the application and start doing payments? One of the things that we can implement in our companies is what we call tier KYC. So we can manage to have a very, very low KYC to allow people to experiment the application, to experiment the new solution. But even so, the company just have a small risk in terms of financial reputation or financial situation, because we don't know for sure all the people, all the persons that are downloading the application. That's one area of how to mitigate, or how can we start an application, a service, without knowing very well the end customer. But for doing that, we must have legislation in place. And there are some countries, including Mozambique, that is not yet regulated this level of tier KYC, for instance. That's one area or one aspect. The other one concerning about technology and how can we implement better technology to overcome possible risks in terms of technology fraud or cyber attacks or whatever. Let me take the words from Allan and say, our startups, fintech startups, most of them, so not saying 90% of them, are very small with very constraints in terms of money that they have to implement the projects. So they cannot put in place a very strong or a very robust data center, for instance, to implement the technology support of the service that they want to provide for the public. And one of the errors that startups are doing, for instance, is trying to start the service with a server that they have under the desk, as we say. So that's a bad practice, and the people and companies must do the things good, must do the infrastructure good from the start. And let me also go to the regulation. There are countries in Africa, one of them is in Mozambique, that is forbidden to use cloud data services. So all the services, all the data must be stored in a computer in the country. So that obliges the companies to have their own data centers with low security and with a high risk for cyber attacks. So that's a thing that we also are discussing in the FinTech Association, is to convince the regulators that we must open the market for using Amazon Web Services, Google services, or IBM data services, because they have robust systems for implementing cyber attacks, detections, and overcome those kind of situations. I will stop for here in terms of how can we manage better in terms of small fintech companies, how can we manage better those technology risks and the last mile risks when we face people that we don't know for sure all the information about them. And even so, we can start doing the service.
Thank you so much. You pose a very pertinent question, and I think as developers, as solution providers, we need to be mindful of the people that we are serving. That's what I'm picking out of that, one of the things. And that brings a question of human-centered design. Our solutions, are we involving the people that we are developing solutions for? I think we need to go back home as listeners today. As we develop the different services, are we mindful of the service and how it will impact the people? Are we involving them to understand whether that's actually the solution they want? And well, then you're able to tire the people definitely, because you know that this client can afford to have a national ID, for example, if it's KYC, but then in this one, if it's a business, they're able to provide a national ID plus certificate of registration. So some of those things, I think I'm trying to think of them as much as practical, because we have different viewers online. But I think those are some of the questions we should be asking ourselves from listening to João. I think those are very good contributions. Quickly going to, this could be answered by either Allan or João. Benny, whoever feels it's comfortable to answer this. As a small startup, because we both interacted with different startups, with small budgets, small startups with a small budget, how effectively or how unaffordably can you manage cybersecurity with the small budgets?
Ian, I will take that. So thank you for that question. And I think the answer was in what you talked about, human-centered design. Our mission actually at Sente is to deliver happiness to our customers, because we always want the customer to be at the center of the solutions that we develop. And if you see risk in our market, whenever people think about cybersecurity and cyber threats, they think about some dangerous hacker from Eastern Europe trying to get into your network. But if you see what's happening into our market, and Ian will testify to this, social engineering is the biggest risk. Somebody calls you up and says, hey, you received money, all you have to do is to send me your PIN, right? And you'll be surprised how many people do that. And so if you don't design with that in mind, without a customer who's semi-illiterate, doesn't understand, then you're exposing them and your system to risk. So for me, my answer for how does a small company with constrained budget manage risk, it is just doing what we do best as startups, and that is hyper-focus on customers. Yeah.
Thank you, Allan. João, do you want to add anything on that?
No, just to completely agree with Allan. And when we design the services, being in focus our target customers, and better, when we design the service together with the customers, we can learn a lot, and we can predict also what type of threats or what type of fragilities we have on the services. So a recommendation is having a close group of customers that we call them, for instance, ambassadors of our company, and with them testing the solutions before going to the open market. That's a good approach, and but once again, as Allan says, it's focus and developing around our customers. Yeah.
And I'd quite like to jump in here and ask Paul. So, Paul, if if people have got a budget, you know, why should they try and spend and use that budget, if in your perspective, to get the most bang for their buck, if that's the phrase to ask?
So I think there's an element of, you need to get the most out of what you're already being given, if that makes sense. So, you know, some things that you buy, so Windows servers, etc., come with built-in security tools. You're not going to pay any extra for those security tools, but if you make sure they're configured properly, then it's a long way to helping you down that line. Equally, you need to think about having choices. So I've seen lots of different people. So you could have a head of information security, you know, who loves different tools and wants to go for best in class at everything. And the problem is that you go for best in class at everything. You might buy CrowdStrike from somebody, you might buy, you know, Menlo, you might buy all these different tools. They all come with a cost, which is what this is. And if you tot it all up, you know, if you went for best in class across all of the different cybersecurity threats, you might be paying $50, $60, $70 per person per month in your organization for license fees. And so you've got to make a choice around, it's back to this, how much am I prepared to accept? Whereas if you went for a suite, so, you know, Cisco offer a suite, Microsoft offer a suite of different tools, you've got an opportunity, and they're, you know, buying a suite is going to cost you an awful lot less than it is buying best in class for all the different pieces. It's actually also going to come with the added benefit of, you know, that they're all going to play nicely with each other. They're all going to work because they're all part of the same organization, so that, you know, that the integration is a lot simpler, and that they'll actually operate well together. The danger with, well, I want to go and have this, I want to have this, and I want to have the next thing, is that the integration problem becomes really big, and you need to spend a lot of time thinking about how to do that integration. And often, back to the whole, you know, the weakest link in any of this is the human. Is actually, if you've got the best cybersecurity tools in the world, but you haven't configured them properly because the human hasn't configured them properly, you know, you're on a hiding to nothing, which goes back to right at my opening start, which is making the most of what you've got. One of the biggest things that is wide open for hackers is pieces of equipment, switches, etc., you know, servers, firewalls, all of the routers, they're all come with baked in passwords straight from the manufacturer. If you fail to change that password, you've just opened the door, you know, that hackers can go and just get the list of passwords and usernames, and they'll just try them. And if they work, brilliant. So there's an awful lot you can do to help yourself before you even have to go and buy tools. And that includes actually at home. I mean, how many of you have changed the admin password on your, if you've got a home router or anything like that?
Brilliant. Thanks for that insight, Paul.
All right. While at that, Paul, I'll probably want to ask you to give us your insight over this. How do we assess that we're managing our risks, or we're managing our cyber risks? How best can we know that it's working, whatever we're doing?
Yeah, it's really hard, right? Because you don't know that it's working until it isn't. So for me, one of the key things is you need to be able to assume that everything's gone horribly wrong, and then ask yourself, how do I recover? How do I recover, and how quickly can I recover? And there is, if anybody's seen the Wired magazine article on the Maersk not Petya attack, or if you haven't, go and read it. It's amazing. So what happened to Maersk was so not Petya was a virus or malware that was created really as part of as a state-on-state. It was infected into a Ukrainian piece of software, Ukrainian accounting software. And Maersk Global Network they had one computer, I think, or a few computers with this Ukrainian accounting software, which just helped them do their tax return in the Ukraine. Anyway, so the update was infected, and once it got onto one machine, within 2 hours, their entire network was taken out. And because they hadn't backed up their Active Directory, they had to start from bare metal. I mean, they were lucky because I can't remember where, but there was a machine that had suffered a power cut in Africa, and so didn't get infected, and they were able to recover the hard drive, which then helped them rebuild. But the key thing is, can you rebuild? Assume that everything's gone, because it might, because there's always a constant battle between the attackers and the attacked, defenders and attackers, and find out how quickly can you recover. And I think that there's a question on there about which security risk can be accepted. Hey, if you don't need to recover, if you've got time, if you were cyber attacked, to rebuild everything before you need to use it again, you could probably accept everything. So first off, back to that question, how do we know whether it's working? Well, I know if it's working enough that if I get hacked and I get ransomware, I don't have to pay the ransom. I can rebuild. I can delete everything and rebuild pretty quickly. I can demonstrate that that works. That's good, right? Then the next thing is you need to think about, well, okay, how good are my tools at spotting stuff? So you can start to use different tools like ethical hackers, red teams, etc., to come and see how good are you. That's another way of finding out whether it's actually working. But you can also put metrics on things. So, for me, if you just took malware, there are a few things that you want to worry about. So malware, key one is you want to be able to recover if it all goes horribly wrong, right? We've just done that. But the other things, there are two things that you really want to do. You want to manage your vulnerabilities, so you reduce the likelihood of it going wrong. And for me, vulnerabilities are things like patching, obsolescence, control of privileged access. And you want some sort of tool that's going to detect, not only known malware, but look heuristically at what I would describe as pattern of life. So it looks at your system and says, this is normal, then looks for the absence of normal or the presence of the abnormal and tells you about it or deals with it. So when you're talking about metrics, you can say, well, okay, what is my patching status? How up to date am I? How many obsolete systems am I running? If I've got a system that's still running Windows 95, is that really an acceptable level of risk? And then when you're looking at your agents that are trying to do this, spot the bad guys, how up to date are they? And if you can say, well, okay, I'm doing my vulnerability scanning, and for example, if there is a critical vulnerability, I can have it patched within 24 hours. That's not bad. You can start to have some metrics around how well am I doing. I'm doing my hygiene, if you like. My hygiene's really good. I can recover if it all goes horribly wrong, because let's face it, the bad guys are often one step ahead. And if they've managed to do something, then you might lose something. And then the other one is, you've got a bigger network. Have I segmented my stuff? And can I make sure that my backups are not connected so that they're going to get infected if that happens as well? And then, of course, my favorite one, if I was going to ask people to do a tabletop to how to recover, is where's the document on how you're going to recover? Please don't tell me it's in your computer.
Thank you so much, Paul. So you bring out an element of testing, which is, I think, very, very critical. When you look at risk management, I know there are a lot of theories and whatever around it, but we all know that there's a need for business continuity, and there's been the question of is business continuity part of risk management, or is risk management part of, I mean, which one is the egg, which one is the chicken? But I guess at the end of the day, as long as you're able to manage your risks, no matter where you start from. But it's important that the only way to know that you're managing risk is by continuously testing. We've had hackathons for those deep into IT and cybersecurity, where you have different teams and there's a red flag you're supposed to probably capture digitally by hacking into each other's systems. And then eventually the winning team probably is assigned the task of rebuilding the firewall and constructing the system. And I think these are coming up a lot, and we're seeing the regulators also opening up to sandboxes, and it's providing us a space for testing these systems and trying them out before we go to market, and also providing the guidelines for the private sector to be able to develop tools which are more secure. I would want to pose that to all those that are within this webinar, Allan and João and the rest who are on the side of development. I think it is something to consider. It may not be as difficult as having to hire a whole pen testing system or some certified system to bring them on board, but you can also internally work with your teams and ask them to test each other's capabilities. And then from there, you can run your reports, and then you're able to know how best to improve. In a few remarks, and really as few as possible, because one give a minute for the viewers to also give in comments and questions. João and Allan, in either order, what is that risk that keeps you awake at night? What is that pain point in terms of risk that you think you can share, and basically how best are you managing it, or what tip can you give us? Thank you.
Good.
Okay, go first, João.
Well, it's difficult to say what risks am I want to take, but let me try to give another perspective and also get some input from Paul, because I believe that he's aware of this. Let me say this. There is currently in Mozambique, and I believe in other countries also, because this is not starting in Mozambique, we are coming together to put in place several teams to manage, in terms of a centralized manner, to manage and to distribute and to inform about cyber risks that are happening in several sectors. We are calling that the Computer Security Incident Response Team. It's the CSIRT teams. I believe that they are also working in other countries, but what we are trying to put here in Mozambique, there is one of these teams that are working well. It's concerning the banking association. So all the banks are come together to put in place this team. These people dedicated to prevent the frauds and in terms of cyber attacks. And what they are doing is to, when they detect a possible attack, they inform all the banks and all the companies. So the fintechs are also they want also to be part of this team. And other sectors like government sectors, transportation sectors, and other sectors are also putting in place those computer security incidents response teams. And all of them are together in the network, and also are integrated with the national network. So that's a way of managing in terms of information and rapidly distribute information about the possible attack in terms of cyber attacks, in terms of risks that the companies are facing, and that will prevent the risks to happen, or the companies can take measures to reduce the impact of the possible risks that can happen. That's a way of doing things, and we are putting that in place in Mozambique, and I believe there in England and other countries, they are more advanced than us. So I'd like also to have the input from Paul about this computer incidents response teams.
Yeah, I think the key there is around sharing intelligence and sharing the learnings from when cybersecurity
That's it,
happened.
sharing, yeah.
But the other thing is you have to have businesses that want to do something about it. I mean, there's the classic stories of ransomware victims who have paid the ransom, and the ransomware team have told them exactly the vulnerabilities that they exploited to get into their system and given them suggestions on how to repair their system. They failed to do that, and so they've been ransomwared by the same team again. And they've just said, well, you know, we told you last time what to do to fix it, albeit, you know, it is a crime, but we told you what to do to fix it. You didn't fix it, so, you know, we've trashed your system again for you. So there is.
So you have to pay. You have to pay again.
Yeah, it's just nuts, right? It's easy for them to just try and milk you, but the key there is, so there's two elements to it, is sharing that information and then people acting on that information. That's the important piece. You know, there's no point in being told, like, this is what you need to do and then not doing anything about it. And that's why I go back to this whole sort of manage your vulnerabilities and your obsolescence. It's often things like vulnerabilities, obsolescence, or misconfigurations that allow people in. Or, as Alan pointed out, social engineering. That's a really, and what Alan said was absolutely right. Design your systems so that you take the human factor out.
Yeah, and Ian, I think your question was, what keeps me up at night? What's that risk that keeps me up at night?
Yes, please, Alan.
I don't know how to classify it, but maybe Paul will be able to classify it. But the risk of my customers' money, right? So we're not a bank, and customers send us money to pass on to their recipients. We also collect money on behalf of our customers. And we literally get nightmares that we might wake up in the morning and there is no money. So that is the, that's the risk that, that we are really scared about. But that said, that is why we're very welcoming of regulation, because regulation helps us or even gives us like standards on how to manage this risk. Like Paul said, and I was happy when he said that, because we've been super aware of that risk, from day one, we've tried to build in ways to manage that risk. So when regulation came, we actually found that we fitted quite well in that framework. So we've not had crazy issues being compliant. But yeah, that's my nightmare. And touch wood, it never happens.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Paul, you asked that probably classify that, but is it an issue of credit? Sorry, not credit. Is it an issue of physical security for the money, or is that liquidity that is the challenge in case that it has been spent or whatever it is?
I think what Alan's talking about is payment fraud, or people hijacking a customer account or hijacking a payment account.
Absolutely,
and redirecting the money somewhere else. And that really is a challenge. And that, you know, that's where you need to introduce as many authentications as you can without upsetting the customer. And that's the space where people talk about multi-factor authentication. So it's not just who you are, it's what you have, or what you are, or those sort of things. I mean, it's interesting that this is it's not new, right? Just because we're doing it digitally or electronically, it's not new. And I used to work for a bank that still tells stories of, when people had left money in the bank, they'd rip a postcard in half and leave half with the bank, and they would have the other half. And so they would have to certify who they were and also present the other half of the postcard. And so it was a token to prove that they were the right person to be able to get that money.
Paul, I would like to ask you a question as a follow-up to that. The risk that I see there is highly internal. Our own people who know the system, who are building the systems, who know all the loopholes better than we'll ever know the loopholes, leveraging that to do that, to put customers' money at risk. How do you manage that?
So I think that's where you have to have segregation of duties. So your developers who are developing the code, for example, I wouldn't allow them to be able to promote the code into production without it going through a code verification activity. So somebody else, so they produce the code, somebody else verifies the code, and then it's, the code, in terms of your coding, to prevent them being able to put in more backdoors. That's one thing. And also then segregation of duties around who can actually have access to do what. So we talk about maybe 4 eyes or 6 eyes or all of these different things. So you have a payment maker and a payment checker, and they can't be the same person. So somebody can't have the ability to make a payment and release a payment. Nobody's allowed to have those two authorities or the ability to log in and do that. So a lot of it's around access management, but also then from your code point of view is how do you keep a secure chain on that code, and how do you make sure that you've not been left any loopholes in the code or backdoors, or so have you, there's a sort of, how do you make sure your secure code development pathway is working? And one of the other great things is a lot of people talk about testing, and I would argue, because sometimes what happens, especially if you're doing a waterfall methodology, you run out of time for testing and people don't bother. You go, oh, we haven't got time for testing because we want to go to deliver. Testing's really important, but not just functional testing, what I would call misuse testing, sorry. So get somebody in who's going to try and break it and try and find all the ways of it not working and try and stuff. You've got a field that's supposed to be just some numbers, but try somebody putting in numbers or SQL injection and all sorts of stuff to see whether it works. And then, you see you're protecting yourself before you even put your code live. Does that make sense, Alan?
Yes, it does. But just as a follow-on, people are really smart.
Yeah, they are.
Sometimes I just wonder whether you can process them out of being smart. Yeah, like.
So so that's when you need to go for anomaly detection as well. It's people. Well, I mean, there's the other one is, of course, is people think things are foolproof, but there's nothing so clever as fools.
Well, I'm going to step in and start to wrap up the conversation, because I know that we've gone slightly over time, but it's been such a fascinating conversation. We are in an industry that comes with risk. There's absolutely no doubt about it. As João said, we can't offer products and services without having some form of risk come in. But I think it's sort of summarizing some of what I'm hearing today. If we know what we are trying to achieve, going back to your, the most important question that you spoke about there, Paul, then if we know what we're trying to achieve, and then we know what our risks are, and let's not make assumptions. So we all seem to think hackers potentially could be a massive risk, but actually, as Allan reminded us, social engineering and sort of small fraud can also be something that actually potentially could be something we're much more vulnerable to. And we may, our small fintechs or companies may not be on the radar of these multinational hackers. So I think as we said, actually knowing what our risks are and then taking appropriate steps to mitigate them will help us. Finding solutions that actually work. And so, using what we have, it doesn't have to cost the earth. Configuring what projects you already have working well is important. And I think we can learn from that story. Don't rely on a power cut in Africa to save your data. We have them, and I guess that's one benefit of that. But actually, knowing how we're going to recover our data is going to be key. So I really loved today's session. It's quite a breath of fresh air for me to talk about openly and honestly about risk, but also to accept that we can't do what we do without at least accepting some and trying to mitigate best against that. And it's also really lovely, Allan, to hear from you. You're welcoming regulation because actually it eases your mind that you're doing the best thing you can by your customers. And I think that's also a really lovely approach to take. So I'm going to say very big thank you, firstly to Ian for moderating today's session with me. Paul, João and Allan, thank you very much too for your expert input and questions and thoughts and advice. I hope our attendees, you've enjoyed today's session. I look forward to seeing you all in a webinar again very soon. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.